welcome to Keys of the Kingdom. I'm Brother Gregory, and we're going to be talking about the Kingdom of God. And we're going to be talking about Leviticus 25. So you can go there if you want, or if you're on the Preparing You website, you can go and load Leviticus 25 and find out what that is all about. But if you just read the text, you probably won't understand what it's about, especially if you have some of the preconceived notions about the Old Testament that is common amongst modern Jews and modern Christians today. Even Christians and Jews at the time of Jesus Christ had a difficult time understanding what Moses was really talking about when he wrote the Torah. And that's very clear that if you had known Moses, you would have known Jesus Christ, and a lot of people did not understand what Jesus Christ was all about, and in fact warred against Jesus Christ, tried to destroy what Jesus Christ was doing, and warred against the early church, which was the people that Christ appointed his kingdom to. See, that's what he came, that you might be saved. God sent his only begotten Son that you might be saved. Jesus did his part, but you may not have done your part. You may not have repented. You may not be actually seeking the kingdom of God in his righteousness. You may be engaged in covetous practices. You may be under a strong delusion. You may have returned to the mire. You may be a worker of iniquity while thinking that you're a Christian. Now, all those things may be true because they were prophesied by Christ and the apostles that this would all take place, that the whole world would even be deceived, even the very elect, except by the grace of God. Now the question is, are you one of those deceived? Are you one of those who have been fooled? And the more important question is, are you willing to repent, to see the truth about yourself and about the deceptions of the world and the deceptions of your generation and the generation that went before you? I mean, how many years has it taken to get to the point where the whole world would be deceived? You would have to do it a step-by-step process. It's not just like one single event. And so you have to accept certain ideas as true that just ain't so. And then they will add upon that lie with more and more deception. Once you've been steered off course just slightly, you know, if you're just a few degrees off course when you leave Los Angeles Harbor headed to Japan, you will not only miss Japan, you will miss Australia, you will miss Africa, you will miss the entire European continent, and you will end up in the Atlantic. If you're just a few degrees off, because if you're just off a little bit, as time goes on, you get farther and farther away from your destination. So, the same in seeking the kingdom of God. If you've got a few things wrong, it can take you in a lot of different directions. And so you should always be forearmed, willing to question what you think you know to be true. Might not be so. And so anyway, when we look at Leviticus and we start examining the text, and I'm not going to necessarily read through every little line because of the fact that it's there. You can read through it yourself. And it said, the Lord spoke to Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. So the land is supposed to keep a Sabbath unto the Lord, and then they proceed to explain that. So what is that? This particular chapter is what they often call the sabbatical and jubilee years. chapter, because the word Jubilee appears mostly in chapter 25, at least as we see it translated, because the word that they translate Jubilee, it's not always translated Jubilee. And there's actually two completely different words that are translated Jubilee in chapter 25. And they're both translated into the English Jubilee. But they're completely different words, and we'll take a look at that before we're done. But probably the most important thing in looking at this old Leviticus chapter is to see how much you've been deceived. So I created a side panel on our Preparing You website that has a number of live links that you can go to and see additional information to start putting these pieces of the puzzle together. Because I want to say some things that are controversial, to say the least, that most people are going to think are wrong, that are not true, because it's different than what they already believe is true. And I understand that I'm attacking your delusion, that I'm pointing out that what you think is so just ain't so. And I shouldn't do that without offering you an alternative, something to put in that place. Because, when you a lot of times what we believe is true, we believe is true so that we just don't go insane, so that we don't drown in this sea of knowledge that we live in. What do you believe? You have to believe something is true. You have to have some sort of, people say, well, I believe in the Bible. Well, so do 40,000 other denominations believe in the Bible, but they all have a different interpretation of what it says. And people who tell me that the Bible interprets itself, well, not really. It's people who, you can put all the Bibles in the world in one room and they won't interpret a darn thing. It's people reading the Bible that interpret it. And it's because they put values on words and phrases, and they make assumptions as to what words mean and what was really going on. And if they're wrong anywhere, it can take them off course. And that error can compound. Unless you think you're perfect, you can't read the Bible and know what's true. What the Bible does tell you is that God will write upon your heart and upon your mind. I don't want to write upon your heart and your mind, but I want to bring you to the understanding that some of what you have previously accepted as true may be in error. You may have mistaken or accepted certain things as true that just ain't so. So anyway, one of the first things I say in the side panel note is people do not understand how the land keep Sabbath for the same reason they do not understand the Sabbath. And they don't understand the altars of clay and stone, nor even the 10 Commandments. They think of the 10 Commandments as the 10 laws. And if those were actually laws, then you would have a series of penalties, in the way we think of the word law today. I shared a number of cities and municipalities are trying to raise revenue by increasing the number of fees and fines that they impose upon the people. And one particular township it's being sued by a kind of a judicial watch group because of the fact that they actually are criminally fining people because they have a crack in their driveway, or they're criminally fining people because their curtains don't match in their house. It turns out that they're making about 24% of the revenue for the municipality in these fees and fines. And they just found out that they can make a lot of money doing this. And so they're fining these people. Of course, now one of the wonderful things about this, from their point of view, wonderful things, is that you find this person and they get all upset and nobody cares. Their neighbors don't care. because I didn't get fined, and I don't want to say anything because they may fine me for something I didn't know. You know, maybe something I painted my house the wrong color trim or something. We're not talking housing associations here. We're talking about actual municipalities. And, I mean, you actually, if you get this fine and you have to pay it, you can actually be put on probation after that. So, I mean, it's horrendous what they're doing. But they're getting away with it because people don't care about what's happening to their neighbor. They just don't want to be fined themselves. And that, America has taken that. What made America great was that people learned to care about one another. They had to, or they didn't survive. They had to care about one another, and they got this kind of collective American identity where you're my neighbor because you're here, geographically speaking, and I have to care about you. And, of course, there's always a certain amount of prejudice. You know, if you're in the South, certain people didn't like blacks, and if you're, you know, up in the Dakotas, certain people didn't like Indians, and so there's always, or, you know, maybe down in Texas you didn't like Mexicans, or, you know, you can always find some, or, you know, if you're in New York, you didn't like Irish, unless you were Irish, and then you didn't like somebody else, English, maybe. So you can always find people that divide, but now people are so divided to, you know, you don't live in my house. And actually, even families, and we'll take a look at this, families are divided. You know, and so the families are all broke down. And what made America great is that we cared about one another. We actually learned a little bit about what it meant to love thy neighbor as thyself. And see, Moses said, love thy neighbor as thyself. That's Jesus quoting Moses when you hear that phrase. But you wouldn't get that feeling that Moses supposedly was the servant of a vengeful God of the Old Testament. Well, that's based on our interpretation of the Old Testament. We don't really understand what the Old Testament is all about. I mean, if you think that God is made happy because you pile up stones and set sheep on fire, kill sheep and set their body, their carcasses on fire, and that makes God happy, you've got something to learn about the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament doesn't talk about that anywhere. And people at the time of Christ, one of the most popular religious groups at the time of Christ, understood and knew that the Pharisaical view of animal sacrifice on piles of stone was a fiction and a fraud. They read Hebrew. They read...
Greg dropped off the call. I'll get him back.
Hello?
Looking
he
for
lost
Greg?
You. Yeah, you lost him. He's on the other line, Greg.
Hello?
Hello.
Am I
lost
now?
You.
Okay, we're back. Anyway, so in case you missed that, there are live links on the page where you can go and read about the altars of clay and stone and find out what they were really all about, because they had nothing to do with piling up rocks, killing sheep, and setting them on fire. And that is one of the great deceptions that has come down. It was a great deception at the time of Jesus Christ, although there were, like I say, large numbers of people who understood that such animal sacrifice was a fiction and a fraud. That's not what they were really telling you to do at all. And once you begin to understand that, and that's a big leap for a lot of people, but we go through it in detail and show you that that's not what those altars were all about. Those altars were about systems of social welfare to take care of the needy of your society through faith, hope, and charity and the perfect law of liberty. The whole story of the Levites and the Levitical priesthood was about service to the congregations of the people. And in Leviticus 25, and in Leviticus in general, they talk about things like tithing. And you tithe to your Levite minister of your choice according to his service. And you're gathered together in groups of 10. They understood those groups of 10 before Jethro mentioned it. Jethro mentioned the groups of 10 in relationship to settling disputes. But they already were organized by Joshua, and they had been organized centuries before by Abraham and by others in these groups of 10. You find this in lots of other texts where, the Greeks had the word symposia, where you'd have this group. We have the word tithing. Tithing men were a group of 10 men, 10 families gathered together. The Teutons did this. Attila the Hun did this. They had these groups of 10 men gathered together. They would pick a minister or whatever you want to call them, and he would gather together with 10 like himself, 9 others like himself, and you would network a whole nation together so that if you were attacked, that people could come together and defend themselves. If there was a fire, people could come together and fight the fire. One of the things in we've had a volunteer fire department in this community for years and years, but now we've created a volunteer range fire system, a rural fire department. And one of the things that they're having training this weekend again, for those who want to be certified, voluntary training, and they're getting donated vehicles and trailers and what have you together to fight these fires. And they come, the range fires, and their job is not really to protect the buildings, but they will protect the buildings because it's part of the reason why, their primary deal is to stop the range fire. And we have a voluntary fire department that can go and focus on buildings while these guys are trying to put out the range fires. But the point is that it's all voluntary system of people taking care of the needs, not putting taxes upon the people, and then making it a forced system. So Nimrod had groups of 10, but he appointed those 10 from the top down. The way Israel worked was the 10 were created from the bottom up. The people organized themselves with the help of the Levites. The same thing went on in the early church. We see Christ commanding that his apostles make the people sit down in companies, they translate it, but again the Greek word is symposia, in ranks of 50 and ranks of 100 to the tune of 1,000, 5,000 people. And this is what they did on Pentecost. Why were they doing this? This was because these people, following the commandment of Moses and the commandment of Christ, would love one another, take care of one another. The word love there is also translated charity, according to what Paul calls the perfect law of liberty. And they will take care of one another in a voluntary system. All the taxes are voluntary. You're taxed yourself. That's why I say, people say, was tithing mandatory or was tithing voluntary? Well, it depends on what you mean by mandatory. God said, tithe. That was the commandment of God. Okay, what do you mean by mandatory today? If you have, in that one city, if you don't have matching curtains, they will fine you. In many jurisdictions, if you don't put a balcony around your your rooftop or your a railing around your balcony, that they can come in and fine you. But in Israel, there's no fine for not putting a railing around your rooftop or on your balcony. They don't fine you. But if someone were to go up there and fall off because you created this hazard, you invited somebody up to a balcony that had a railing that just gave way when you touched it, that's almost like a man trap. I mean, if you dig a pit, if you create a dangerous situation that is not necessarily, along the edge of a path, you dig a pit, and somebody walks along and they fall into the pit that you dug right there because it's at night and they didn't see it, and you didn't have it roped off, you can be held responsible. You're not fined before the fact. They're saying you have to take care of one another. You have to think about the needs of one another. You have to, if you're going to invite people out on your balcony, you should have a rail there that isn't going to cause them to fall off right away. And if you create that hazardous situation and somebody gets hurt, you could be held responsible for them getting hurt. People read all these statutes of Moses as if they're some sort of checklist law. Moses wrote those statutes to help you understand the basics of the Ten Commandments. It's like, thou shalt not commit adultery. So let me ask you this. I just heard recently, Baskin-Robbins, they have 23 flavors. I think they used to have 28, but then they ended up with 32 flavors, maybe, whatever it is, of ice cream. One of the founders of Baskin-Robbins, way back, decided that his ice cream was bad for you. To eat that much ice cream was bad for your health, and he walked away from the Baskin-Robbins fortune and went off and learned to eat healthy. I think he moved to an island or something with his family, and is now kind of a health nut, trying to teach people how to eat right. So he saw there was a problem with what people were consuming. Well, there's a problem with what you're thinking. Adultery has to do with that as much as it has to do with sexual adultery. You're adulterating your body. You're adulterating the temple. We'll be back.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
So welcome back to Keys of the Kingdom. Some of the things that you need to understand is, like we're talking, the 10 Commandments is not just 10 laws, but 10 guideposts. They're trying to show you a way. They're trying to show you that, people ask, well, what are the penalties in the 10 Commandments? If you violate the 10 Commandments, I shouldn't just say break, but if you go against the spirit of the 10 Commandments, the penalty is built in. Thou shalt not jump off a cliff, for thou shalt fall to the ground below. That's basically what the 10 Commandments is all about, that if you go this way, bad things will happen. It's built in already. So if you adulterate your body, if you adulterate your marriage, if you adulterate your relationships with other people by bringing in elements that don't belong there, that you will suffer the consequences of that adulteration. Thou shalt not adulterate the purpose. The whole thing with fornication, which is relationships outside of marriage, homosexuality, which is a relationship outside of nature. It defeats the purpose of sexuality, which is reproduction. All these things are adulterations. They come in many, many different forms, and you could have your "Thou shalt not commit adultery," and then underneath it you could put in an outline, "Thou shalt not eat 32 flavors of Baskin-Robbins ice cream in one day," because that's bad for you. It's unhealthy. It's adulterating your body. Now, that list could go on endlessly. Most of the medical problems that people are suffering today comes from the fact that they are not eating the right foods, and they're not eating in the right way. And they're feeding their tongues, sweet in the mouth but sour in the belly. They're not taking care of this physical temple of the Holy Spirit that God has given them. And it shows. Depression. Somebody was contacting me wanting to know about Reiki. Reiki, which is a Japanese laying on of hands. And they said, well, can that help? And I said, they're asking me this by way of somebody else. And I says, well, it depends on who's laying on of hands, because the apostles were laying on of hands and people were being healed. How are they laying on of hands, and who is doing it, and why are they doing it? What's the motivation? What's the procedure? Just slapping a Japanese word on the label doesn't make it necessarily a good thing. And then they ask, well, supposedly this person can give them a session over the phone. They don't even have to be there. Well, I think that you're probably got a better place to spend your money. Really what you want to do is take a look at your own heart and your own mind, because the 10 Commandments, the altars of clay, the Sabbath, it's all about virtue and virtual practice, spiritual precepts that are expressed in these metaphors of altars of clay and stone. But people are always desiring to reduce those spiritual precepts concerning virtuous practices and down to, rules and laws and a checklist that can be itemized and enforced, because they don't really have the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is a lot more free with what you're supposed to be doing and how you're supposed to be interacting with one another. That once you apply these spiritual principles, then the dance relationship with interacting with other people becomes entirely different. It becomes something of beauty. But if you reduce it down to this analyzed, analytical approach, which is what you do when you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you're going to decide, well, let's see, in my checklist of bad things and good things, this falls in this checklist. And we are to have the tree of knowledge, but that is not what is supposed to be the guiding force in our life. It is the tree of life, the Holy Spirit, that is to be the guiding force in our life. And so those 10 commandments are like 10 signposts, and as well as all the other Levitical rules and everything. They're trying to tell you principles by which you function. And we're going to show you that you're not functioning according to those principles. You're not functioning according to virtuous practices, but rather you're functioning according to covetous practices. You're not loving your neighbor as yourself. You're loving yourself more than you love your neighbor. Because everybody on that street, when they heard that their nice lady neighbor was getting fined because there was a crack in her driveway, an immaculate, nice-looking, but it's a long driveway and there's a few cracks in it. It doesn't need to be replaced. It doesn't look like a slum or anything. There's just some cracks in her driveway. If they were truly Christians on that block, they would stand against the city and they would all protest. You don't find this lady. She's a nice lady. She's hardworking. She's industrious. Those cracks are not a problem. And they might even get together and help fix the cracks. If maybe she is having a little bit of a hard time. Maybe she's old. Maybe she had other expenses. Maybe she has health problems. She's been eating too much Baskin-Robbins. I don't know what their problem is. But the reality is I can tell you what the society's problem is. They don't care about her problem. They only care about it when it affects them. Because Christ is not in them. Oh, they may go to church. They may sing songs. They may tell you that they believe in Jesus. But they don't attend to the weightier matters of law, judgment, mercy, and faith. That's what Christ says is the weightier matters. Law, judgment, mercy, and faith. Well, how is that? Is that justice? How is that mercy? If they let that woman be fined because there's a few cracks in her driveway, or somebody else fined because their drapes don't match. I can't remember some of the other just absolute ludicrous fines. They're just grasping at straw to find things wrong with people so that they can get money out of them. It's terribly corrupt, but people don't care about one another. And Leviticus is trying to tell you to watch out for this, to cry out, to say, wait a minute here, this is unfair. And there's so many misconceptions because of the fact that they approach this list as a checklist of laws and regulations, very parasitical. And they don't understand the spiritual principles behind what Moses is trying to tell you. The same with the railing around your balcony or digging a pit, creating a hazard. You don't understand justice and mercy, responsibility and rights. So that's why you don't have as many rights anymore than you used to have. You've gone away from the ways of Christ. You're not doing what Christ said. You're not doing, if you're Jewish, you're not doing what Moses said. You need to take another look at this. So, and not just through the tree of knowledge. Yeah, I'm using knowledge now to point out some of these problems. Let's take a look at the word Jubilee. The word we see translated Jubilee is Yovel. It's actually composed of a number of Hebrew letters, which evidently I can see there's a little bit of a problem with coding here. But anyway, because I just put this together this morning, but I'll have that straightened out by the time a lot of people listen to this. But it's that word. It's consisted of this. The basic is lamad, biat, yad. Lamad is the word for hand, the letter for hand. Whenever you see that lamad, it has something to do with the hand in the basic meanings of the Hebrew letters. Biat has something to do with household. Yad has something to do with the divine spark within us, the divine spark of God, inspiration of God within us. So that's what you would think that word means, that it has to do with this, the hand, the house, and the divine spark. The word is actually, I'm wondering here if I've got some of this, that particular word that is translated Jubilee is actually the word ram's horn. It's like a trumpet or a cornet, they say, when you look up the translation. But what's the horn, and why did the Israelites have these ram's horns all the time? Well, they had ram's horns because they had a lot of sheep. They were in sheep country, and they had sheep that have these horns, and they would blow these horns, and it would make a noise. And so we have this idea, this picture of all the Israelites traveling across the desert in a single line or something from the movie Moses. The reality is those sheep had to eat grass every day, and so they were spread out all over the place. So they were traveling. They were Israelites. They were bound together by these altars of stone, which were living stone, and altars of clay, which were living clay. That's people, Adama. And people would attack them. They would try to rob them. Maybe animals would come and try to eat their flocks. They had to help each other out. Well, how did you know that somebody needed help? Ram's horn. They'd blow the horn, and you had to come. So when the building inspector shows up to give that woman a fine for cracks in her driveway, or the code enforcement inspector comes, she should be able to go out there and blow her ram's horn, and all the neighbors on her block come over there and say, "What are you doing to this nice lady?" Guess what? He'll leave. But nobody will come anymore. You can blow the ram's horn, and they'll just think you're a wacko. And I'm not actually saying that everybody has to blow the ram's horn. What I'm saying is that this is the principle of the thing, is that you love your neighbor. You actually show up for your neighbor. You care about your neighbor. You've forgotten that. I keep remembering while I'm talking, flashing on the guys who came over here early in America. They came over for a lot of different reasons, and the harshness of the American wilderness caused them to rethink some of the things that they thought before. And there was a group that came over in this little rowboat. I mean, literally like a rowboat. It was just an open boat, no cabin or nothing. And it was the Sparrow. And they still have parts of that boat now in a museum. And it was just a little tiny. And they came over. This was early settlers came over. And they were starving to death in no time. And the Indians were like walking around and just waiting for them to die and steal their shoes and everything else they had. And somebody headed they knew there was another settlement to the south, and they headed south to Plymouth. And they came across a guy in the woods, or a couple guys in the woods. And they sent somebody back for help, and another guy went there right away, and they gathered these guys up, and they couldn't even stand. They were in such bad way. And they gathered them up and fed them and took their stuff back and housed them, and they got them back on their feet and started teaching them how to take care of themselves in this wilderness. Otherwise, the Indians were just going to clump them in the head once they dropped dead and steal everything they had. And there were good Indians, and there were bad Indians, and there were good European settlers, and there were bad European settlers, and that's the difference. Is not the color of your clothes or the print of your Bible, but how you actually relate to one another. There's other words that are translated into Jubilee as well, and more commonly maybe, but they're also translated into the word shout or to cry out. And we'll take a look at some of those words as we go through the text here, because you've got two completely different words that are translated into Jubilee. And from what I see, from reading the text in the original Hebrew, that what they're not talking about some event. They talk about 7 years. That's another thing. Okay, you sell your land for 7 years to somebody, and then, well, what it is you're actually loaning your land to somebody in order to get like almost a rent payment back for 7 years, and then the land reverts back to you. You could sell your land out completely. Somebody pointed that out, and they said, well, they did. The Israelites didn't really own their land because they couldn't sell their land. Well, they could sell their land, and they did sell their land. And here, I'll give you another little hint. Israel is not that geographical location over there in the Middle East. That's not Israel. Israel is wherever men who have the faith of Abraham walk, wherever they put their foot. That's Israel. Now, historically speaking, there was a lot of Israelite stuff that came down to us through history that took place in that particular geographical area. But Israel is any place where God's way prevails. It's not a geographical location. It's a way. It's a principle. It's a spiritual principle that must first be written in your heart and then written in your actions. And when I point out to the fact that, somebody is, being robbed by a government agency that is using its power to tax 24% of its revenue by fining little old ladies with a crack in their driveway, and you don't do anything about it, then I can give you hundreds and hundreds of examples of how the courts have robbed people. Judges have robbed people of their land through the courts because they know how it works, and got away with it. While everybody in town, just clear robbery. Everybody in town was going to church and praising Jesus, while their neighbor was being robbed by the courts, and nobody showed up. I went on court watch for years and years. I would show up, and it's a 200-mile round trip for me to go to a courthouse. That was a big expense to go there and show up when somebody was being mistreated in the courts. And one guy in particular, I remember, I went down there time and time again, and then you get there, and there would be like 20, 30 people show up to be there at his trial because he was getting run through the ringer. And we'd all get in there, and they would postpone it to another day. So then we'd all come back on another day. But, the second time we came back, there wasn't quite as many people. Finally, when they had the trial the third time, it was myself, my daughter, and one other guy. Oh, Woody Webb, he showed up. Nobody else showed up. They had the trial. They convicted him on evidence that was never submitted in court, that the defending attorney said he never saw, and the judge said that he was convicted based on that evidence, and it was a hearing to send him back to jail for something he never did. It's a long story, but total travesty of justice, and people didn't show up time and time again. But then when they did show up, then they just postponed it until nobody showed up, and then they could send them away. But I learned a lot through this experience, and mostly what I learned is most of you do not care about your neighbor as much as you care about yourself. And most of you should be under tribute because you're slothful in the ways of God. And you should be stuck in the mire and back in bondage of Egypt. And that's where you're at. And it's worse for you than it was in Egypt. In Egypt, you only had to pay 20%, 1/5 of your labor belonged to the government. You had to work 1/5 of the year for the government. And that was the bondage of Egypt. You didn't own your land. Egypt owned the land. You didn't own it, but you were serfs upon it. And they could get away with that for a while, but through crafts of state, the burden got greater and greater and greater, and there wasn't anything you could do about it, except you had to turn around and think a different way. You had to start caring about one another. In order for God to teach you how to care about one another, he sent the plagues. He hardened the heart of the Pharaoh so that Pharaoh was not going to let you go when Moses came to take the people that belonged to him. He said, you can have the throne, you can have Egypt, you can have all the aqueducts and the system that has been built up here, and I just give me the people and I will go with the people. Kind of like Abraham. I'm not going to even take a buckle. I don't want any of this stuff. You can have all this stuff, but the people are free to choose. And many of the people chose to go with Moses. The Egyptians even chose to go with Moses. And by the time the plagues were over, the people were blessing the Israelites with gold and silver because they were a greater help than the government was during those plagues. But you don't read it that way because your ministers are telling you something else. But that's what they were doing. They were learning how to care for one another. This whole thing of Jubilee and the Sabbath, you care about the land, you care about one another, you care about the ownership of your neighbor. If he falls on hard times and he has to sell his property for 7 years, then he should get it back at the end of 7 years. If he's still on hard times, it goes on, but eventually you try to get the land back to that family. And here's what I was going to say about the family. You have to not only love your neighbor as yourself, you have to love your neighbor's children as yourself. The same as you have to love your children and your children's children before they're even born. So when you own land as an Israelite, not just in Israel, anywhere, as a follower of God, as a person where God prevails in your heart, you have to care about your children. You don't just sell your land so that you can, or sell your labor or sell whatever so you can get free stuff now. You have to care about the next generation, even before it's born. Today, we look out in the world, they not only don't care about the next generation, and they curse their children with debt because they want benefits today, they actually don't even want their children to live. They're aborting them by tens of thousands of children on a regular basis. They just passed a law in Ireland where abortion is now legal. It was illegal before. And the women are all cheering because now we get to kill our babies. instead of produce the next generation. And you think you're Christians? You think you're followers of Christ? No. How can you get to that point? Well, you've gotten to that point, or people have gotten to that point. And you may say, well, I'm against abortion. But are you, somebody said that, talking about, was tithing mandatory? Well, it was mandatory from the point of view of God, but the Levites couldn't come in and kick in your door and force you to contribute. They couldn't fine you if you didn't and increase the fees of tithing because you didn't send it in. It was a voluntary system, and you tithe to them according to their service. That's what it says. But you had the choice who to tithe to, when to tithe to, how much to tithe to. But if you didn't do that, something else. We'll be back. He's the King.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.